Look, we all love villains who do villainous things, but how about when they surprise us and actually do something heroic? Is there such a thing as a heroic villain?
Yes.
There have been instances where your favorite villains have done some things that some would call, gasp, good. I'm breaking down all the heroic things your favorite Marvel villains have done, but don't tell anyone, or else they'll all lose their membership to Villains Digest Weekly, and you know how much they love that. Anyways, you want to hear about how Thanos led the Avengers? Of course you do. Let's get started. So for this list, I'll be talking a lot about the most heroic instances from the comics, but also, when applicable, add in some movie examples as well, because, you know, synergy and all that. Plus, it's fun to get a wide spectrum view of a certain villain in different situations and variations. So first, I'm going to talk about Dr. Octopus. Yes, Peter, Otto Octavius is his real name. You can stop laughing now. Seriously? You hang around with superheroes and supervillains all the time, but you think Otto Octavius sounds like a made-up name? Anyways, Doc Ock is one of Spidey's main villains and has battled the Webhead for years. He's usually portrayed as a man with a tremendous ego who wants to prove his superiority over everyone. This ego usually ends up with him trying to do something evil and resulting in a solid thumping from the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. But that never seems to deter him to try again later. The ego also helped pave the way for his most heroic arc. At the end of the Dying Wish story arc, Otto switched bodies with Peter, and seemingly erased Peter's mind, and thus launched a new comic storyline titled Superior Spider-Man. Because of the ego the size of Mercury, Otto decided to not just use Peter's Spider-Man identity and powers for evil, but rather set out to prove that he was in fact a better Spider-Man than Peter was. Some ways were more successful than others, like yes, Otto as Peter actually won over J. Jonah Jameson for the first time in his life, and ended up significantly helping Peter's personal life. But it was clear that Otto wasn't afraid to unalive certain criminals and create a more strict structure regarding law and order. Although you could argue this whole time was filled with different heroic moments, the biggest one comes at the end of the arc, which sees Norman Osborn return and cause chaos as the Goblin King. Someone Otto loves is in danger, and Otto knows he's not strong enough to stop Norman and save his love. So he finally admits that Peter was the superior Spider-Man, and then makes the conscious choice to switch back, erasing his own mind in the process. He sacrificed himself so evil could be stopped and Peter could come back, and if that doesn't bring a tear to your eye, then I don't know what does. Of course, this is a comic, so Doc Ock didn't stay gone forever, but it's still a nice sentiment. And I think it's pretty cool that the movie version of Doc Ock had basically two big heroic moments. Spider-Man 2 is one of the best superhero sequels ever, and Alfred Molina brings a sense of tragedy to the role of Otto, especially at the end. When he realizes how much of a monster he's become, he fights back and gains control of the arms for a second, allowing him to destroy his gigantic bomb machine. He knows what he did was wrong, and his last act in life was trying to make up for it. But as we know, it wasn't truly his last act. Spider-Man No Way Home saw Doc Ock plucked from the timeline, I guess right before he turned good, which must have been confusing for Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, and boy, I sure hope Peter stopped that machine by himself. But anyways, in No Way Home, Peter used the magic box in Happy's laundry room to create a chip that would stop the arms from screaming in Doc Ock's head 24/7. And once he did that, Otto came to his senses and would come to help Peter at the Statue of Liberty, doing the classic, hey, I'm a bad guy, but psych, I'm a good guy ploy to trick Electro. And then there's one really cool moment. When Green Goblin shows up and starts chucking pumpkin bombs, Doc Ock actually blocks all three Spider-Men from getting hit. It's a nice moment. Boy, thinking about it, I really hope when this Doc Ock goes back to his timeline, he doesn't suddenly arrive at the bottom of the ocean. Although Venom went through a major character change where he's mostly an anti-hero now, I still think Venom is at his most heroic when fighting Carnage. There's just something about fighting the more evil, more powerful, crazier version of yourself that really puts things into perspective. So the two have battled on quite a few occasions, giving Venom a chance to step up and be the true hero. But my favorite has to be from the original Carnage Unleashed storyline. In that 90s arc, the gist is that people wanted to make a video game about Carnage, and Carnage wasn't too happy with that. A lot of destruction occurs, and while Venom tries to stop him, it takes the two into the internet to battle it out. And mainly, I just like this because of peak 90s era internet jargon. Like at one point, some rando says his modem is talking to my modem, even as we speak. Hear those squawks and beeps? Ah yes, the squawks and beeps. Who else else remembers those fondly? The two use their symbiotes to fight digitally, and New York gets to watch on a giant billboard. Venom wins by frying the heat sink, as he calls it, to turn up the temperature on Carnage, forcing him out of the game. I like to think of this as Venom saving the internet, because if Carnage was free to move unchecked, then who knows what would have happened. And I need the internet in my life. What else would I do? Go outside? Hard pass. And I think overall the movie Venom is even more heroic than the comic Venom. Movie Venom constantly wants to eat bad guys and brains, but Eddie tries his best to stop him, making sure he only eats chickens. And he more or less saves the day a lot. But of course, maybe it's less heroic in There Will Be Carnage when the Venom symbiote keeps jumping hosts whenever someone burns out because those people aren't alive anymore, right? And it will be interesting to see the future of Venom on the big screen. I think we're leading to a Sinister Six movie, but will that group be reimagined as a group of anti-heroes? I wouldn't necessarily mind that. Norman Osborn is certifiably one of the biggest villains in the Marvel Universe. Sure, he's not a huge planet eater or anything, but he's rich, he's smart, and he knows how to sway the American people into giving him what he wants. And it's not like he's a destroy literally everything type of bad guy. No, when aliens come to invade Earth and enslave humanity or whatever, Norman knows that he needs to fight back. That's basically the gist of his arc in the Secret Invasion storyline, which saw the Skrulls descend on Earth led by Queen Varanki. And in such a climactic event, you'd imagine one of our big heroes would be the one to ultimately stop her, right? Well, actually no. It was actually Norman Osborn who stepped up and took out the Skrull Queen with a sniper rifle. And yes, there is clearly an argument about whether taking a life truly counts as heroic, but on the surface, it's the most heroic thing Norman Osborn has ever done. And although this helped end Secret Invasion, it set up the next arc perfectly. The whole world saw Osborn be the one to take out the Skrull threat, and while Tony Stark was essentially blamed for letting the Secret Invasion happen, Osborn came out of it looking great. S.H.I.E.L.D. was shut down, and in its place we saw the Thunderbolts initiative, led by Norman, rise up, and it essentially drove all the actual superheroes basically underground. So yes, while Norman did do a heroic thing by helping stop the Skrulls, it was basically the catalyst for him to become even more evil, so that's kind of a bummer. But let's talk about the Norman Osborn from the movies. Sam Raimi's original Spider-Man saw Norman taken over by the Goblin persona, but really No Way Home highlighted Norman's fractured psyche on a much more interesting level. It seemed like truly a battle between good Norman and bad Norman in No Way Home, with bad Norman ultimately winning out until the very end. But there was a second there where good Norman broke all of our hearts. He was just a scientist who desperately didn't want to be a bad guy and truly wanted to help himself and others. His grief and guilt over what he did after being cured was a surprisingly affecting moment. But it helped prove that although the Goblin Serum turned him into one of the scariest looking dudes alive, there was still a good person underneath it all, you know? The most heroic thing Dr. Doom has ever done was take up the Iron Man mantle for a bit. That was nice of him, right? The circumstances around this are kind of fascinating. So you all remember in Secret Wars when Doom briefly took over the multiverse and made himself a god? Yeah, that part wasn't really that heroic, but it gets better. After reality was reconstructed and rebuilt, Doom was a slightly different person. One who thought that after Tony Stark passed away for like the millionth time, that he should step up and honor his legacy to become the new Iron Man. Basically, he combined Stark tech with his own specialty brand of tech and other skills to become the infamous Iron Man, legitimately trying to be a hero. Of course, this was hard for him because literally everyone around him just couldn't trust the guy who had more than once been an ultimate evil for Earth. Some people tried to stop him, thinking that Doom trying to be Iron Man for a bit wasn't the best idea, and it would lead to Latveria becoming powerful and dangerous again. One thing of interest to note is that out of everyone, Doom actually did win over Riri Williams, and she saw that he was legitimately trying to be a good guy. But this is one of those instances where just enough people couldn't trust him, and nobody took him seriously. Plus, when Tony was resurrected, it was only a matter of time before things ultimately went back to status quo. Do I want to talk about Dr. Doom in the movies? No, I really don't want to talk about Dr. Doom in the movies. I'll just say that whenever they reboot Doom for the MCU, make him interesting and complex like his comic counterpart deal. Loki is one of the most likable and charming characters in the MCU. I mean, he was so likable that he got his own spin-off show after he was executed in Endgame. Who else has that kind of power? Anyway, I'll talk about movie Loki's heroics in a second, but first, let's talk about comic Loki. I think a really fun comic event is the Axis crossover, which has a section where Scarlet Witch and Doctor Doom cast an inversion spell that accidentally reverses the morality of everyone in that certain space. Whoopsie. So heroes become villains and villains become heroes. Loki, who we all know as the god of mischief, becomes the god of heroism and truth, while Thor is an overall villain. Yes, this means he becomes worthy enough to lift Thor's hammer, and Loki used it to help save the day. See, Loki, all it takes is an inversion spell to literally flip your morality, and then you can become a hero. Well, the movie Loki might have an easier time with that. Movie Loki started off as the villain. Yes, he was sympathetic and was just trying to earn his daddy's love, but he was still the bad guy. Then there was that whole invading New York thing, which has been retconned a bit in saying the Mind Stone was warping Loki's brain and making him more evil. After that though, hero arc, baby! He slowly came over to the good side, and Thor Ragnarok cemented his fixed relationship with his brother and his desire to do good again. How did the universe repay him? By having Thanos suddenly knock on their front door and wipe out half the Asgardians. The bittersweet thing about his endgame demise is that Loki probably wouldn't have been choked out if he was still the scheming bad guy he once was. And then doubling down on this, 2012 Loki, after jumping through space and time into his own TV show, went through a similar redemption arc where he got to play the hero. Here's hoping that somewhere down the line Loki joins the Avengers. That'd be fun. Maybe on the surface you could see why Magneto teams up with Red Skull. Both are bad guys who want certain evil things, and both have very particular and brutal thoughts about what it takes to achieve their goals. But then, if you look a little deeper, you realize why this partnership just doesn't work at all. Red Skull has certain ideologies that directly affect Magneto, you know what I mean? In the 1990s storyline, Acts of Vengeance, a bunch of supervillains team up. But once Magneto finds out what exactly Red Skull's history is, Magneto responds by burying him alive and leaving him to rot. This wasn't their only encounter though. Much later, Red Skull gets to a point where he becomes a powerful telepath, and has constructed a mutant re-education camp, which, yeah, does not sit well with Magneto, as you can imagine. Ultimately, the two fight again, and after a particularly brutal back and forth, which sees things like Red Skull capturing Magneto and forcing him to relive visions of his time in the concentration camps, Magneto gains the upper hand and ultimately smashes Red Skull's brain with some debris. Like, it's not even a cool metal-related defeat. Just one dude picking up some rubble and smashing another dude with it. Brutal. And yes, this may not necessarily be a heroic act, and it ultimately released the Onslaught persona, but I have to say, seeing Magneto beat up someone with Red Skull's ideology is particularly satisfying. Remember the What If episode where it showed us that really all that was needed to save the universe was to sit Thanos down and calmly explain why his plan was horrible? Wild. And sure, you can take that as canon as you want it, but there's something to be said about Thanos' desire to actually save the day. Yes, his methods are bad, but he ultimately thinks what he's doing is right. That's all set up for this next example, which saw Thanos leading the Avengers in the comics. Yes, it's an alternate universe, so it doesn't necessarily count, but there's something about seeing Thanos utter Captain America's famous Avengers Assemble line and leap into battle to help his fellow heroes that's surprisingly satisfying. And while OG Thanos disagreed with this version of Thanos, I think he liked the respect and admiration the alternate counterpart got. I really like Skurge. I'll admit, I didn't know much about him before the Thor Ragnarok movie, but he was played by Karl Urban, and Karl Urban instantly makes everything at least 12 times better. And Skurge's arc in Thor Ragnarok was a nice one. He started off as a weak-willed nobody who valued stuff above all else, but then soon realized the error of his ways and tried to make up for it. Yes, we've seen villains do that before, but have we ever seen them do it with a twin pair of M16A1 assault rifles? I don't think so. Skurge sacrifices himself so the Asgardians can get away, leaping into the pathway of Hela's forces. He obviously knew he wouldn't survive, but I wonder if he knew just how cool he'd look doing it. And what I like about this moment is that it's actually pretty similar to the comic, which saw Skurge make a similar sacrifice. So overall, just a double whammy of Skurge sacrifice. Namor is one of the most fascinating Marvel characters because he could be written either way. Like, yeah, in the main universe, you know the big dogs like Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor will all be heroes. But Namor legitimately could go either way. He started off as a villain in the comics before becoming a hero, before becoming more of an anti-hero, before dabbling in villainy again. It's a lot of flip-flopping around. But I think the moment where he officially becomes an Avenger is an overall great benchmark for the character. After being on the opposite side of things for so long, Cap officially extends him an invitation to join their ranks. It's fun because right before that, Namor basically brings the Avengers a lot of fish and clams and lobster to eat. You think Aquaman would do that? I don't think so. Overall, it will be interesting to see Namor in the MCU. Will he be more of a villain in the Black Panther sequel, or an anti-hero, or someone who eventually turns into a hero? It's really tough to say. Yeah, I wanted to end on Morbius. This is just a reminder that there is a Morbius movie coming out and we should be able to see it any year now. Okay, fine, let's throw in a Morbius heroic act for funsies. One of the best Morbius moments that's also pretty heroic is when, after he's replaced with a zombie version of himself in the main timeline, the real Morbius basically breaks free and destroys his zombie self without much hesitation. Some people would be hesitant to get rid of themselves, but not Morbius. He knows what needs to be done. And there's a funny line about how he'll need to be in therapy forever now since he just destroyed basically himself. Classic Morbius. I'm just going to be honest with you, I'd be more excited for the Morbius movie if I knew there would be zombies in it. Zombies make everything better. Let's flip things around for a second and talk about when heroes have done villainous things. Like, I know there are serious examples out there, but all I can think about is how Hawkeye in the MCU made the ultimate villain move and got a bad haircut that made my eyeballs melt. Sounds pretty villainous, right?